Every year, hundreds of thousands of visitors from Canada, the United States, Europe, come here to the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean. It's one of the most popular southern destinations for people seeking relief from that bleak winter weather back home. And it's easy to see why it's so popular. As the Dominican saying goes, they can offer tourists the 5 S's: sun, sea, sand, song, and sex. And when it comes time to return home, no doubt a few of those tourists feel just a little bit envious of the people fortunate enough to live in this tropical paradise all year round.
I loved it. I loved everything. It was the best week I've maybe ever had. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, good food, good accommodations, people were friendly.
The weather was awesome. When you leave snow and you hit, probably 90s all week, it was awesome.
But paradise often looks very different from within than it does from without. On the 29th of July, 2004, 86 Dominicans boarded a small wooden boat and tried to reach the neighboring island of Puerto Rico, only 100 miles away. The boat's small engine gave out 2 days later before reaching its destination. Its captain then boarded another migrant boat, abandoning his passengers without food or water. They drifted for 2 weeks, during which time nursing mothers were forced to provide breast milk to feed the others. There was even talk of eating parts of the bodies of those who had died. In the end, only 31 survived, drifting back to the country they had tried to flee. 55 others died. They weren't alone in their efforts to leave the Dominican Republic. In the 10 months prior to this attempt, more than 7,000 Dominicans had been caught and detained while trying to enter Puerto Rico illegally. It's difficult to estimate how many more have avoided detection or how many others have died in their efforts to leave this island paradise. These people have a very different experience of the Dominican Republic than tourists do. This is Santo Domingo, the Dominican capital city. It's the first and oldest European city in all of the Americas. And I'm with Andres Fortunato, the executive director of the Dominican YMCA, who has taken me to visit one of the city's most celebrated sites, the Cerro a Colón, or Columbus Lighthouse. It's a gigantic pyramid-like structure built to house what may or may not be the remains of Christopher Columbus. There is some dispute about that. Seville, Spain claims they actually have Columbus buried in their cathedral, so who knows? Across the street from the Cerro, for the benefit of tourists to the area, there is a wall.
Rick, you know what it is?
No, I don't.
This wall was built by the Dominican government for the beautification programs, but the people really call it the Wall of Shame.
Andres explains that the wall was put up early in the 1990s as part of the beautification project undertaken by the Dominican government in preparation for the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival on this island. The Dominican government was expecting a lot of tourists for that 500th anniversary. The beautification project was intended to spruce the city up for the visitors. The purpose of this wall, and that row of apartment buildings over there, was simply to conceal this. This is the barrio, or neighborhood of Maquiteria. These small concrete block dwellings are typical of the homes of the majority of Dominicans. As Andres shows me about, it strikes me that not many Canadians would feel comfortable living here.
This is a group of ladies online to buy a chicken meat.
Mándame a Marta para acá con toda la familia. En diciembre de esta ya de estaba.
Allá van a decidir a un tigre tan famoso, mira, picando carne.
Pues no come entonces.
This is the YMCA daycare in Macataria. Before the beautification project, it had a large backyard, a playground for the children, and a small building in back, half of which was used as a kindergarten and the other half as a caretaker's residence. It was all lost in the expropriations.
Our area was reduced more than 50% to what you can see right now.
Andres tells me that in order to make the area more attractive for tourists, people's homes were torn down. The government did promise to provide the materials to build new ones, but the families were taken out of the city, too far for them to find work, and the government essentially gave them the rubble of their destroyed homes as new building material. The people of Macataria don't spend much time on the tourist beaches of Puerto Plata. The Dominican Republic is a developing country, what we used to call a third world country. The term third world is still in use, but some people no longer think it politically correct. In fact, when the term originated, it wasn't intended to suggest a ranking of nations. It was just making a distinction between the two great superpowers of the day and the rest of the world. The United States and her allies, which would have included Canada, Western Europe, and Japan, they were the first world. The Soviet Union and her allies were the second world. Third world, then, was everybody else. Well, it turned out that everybody else was most of the people on the planet. It included all of the countries of Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, except for Israel, the Indian subcontinent, most of Asia, and the Pacific Rim, except for Australia and New Zealand. In all, those nations now account for some 80% of the world's population. Well, the Soviet bloc no longer exists, and there's only one superpower left, so the term Third World is passé. But the term did serve, and continues to serve, a very important function. It stressed that, at least from the point of view of people living in the first and second worlds, the 20% of us fortunate enough to live in countries like the United States, Canada, France, or even Russia, that from our perspective, these third world countries are somehow different. They're not like us.
To me, a third world country is any country that has a mass population, most of the population that can't afford to feed, clothe, or medically take care of themselves.
They need more help. They need more help. They need better education, more help from other people that are around them, from the countries that are closest to them that should be giving it to them that don't. They just need to be taught the basics.
But some examples that would spring to mind would be Somalia, Iraq, places that have been just war has totally destroyed their way of life and things like that.
Well, I think war is the problem in those countries more than anything else, and poor economy.
It's very poor, not a country that I would like to live in. You feel bad for the people over there. And I don't know what else I can tell you. There's two classes, the rich and the poor.
I suppose the first thing that comes to most people's minds when they think about a developing country is poverty. And certainly Macataria is poor. But poverty and wealth are relative concepts, and in fact, the conditions in Macataria might look pretty good to some of these people who are coming into the Dominican Republic from Haiti. Nations are rich or poor for pretty much the same reason people are. It basically comes down to how much money they generate. With nations, this is what we sometimes call their per capita gross national product. GNP is a figure that's calculated by dividing the annual wealth of a country by its population. What that figure won't tell you is how the wealth is distributed. So you could have a country with a fairly high per capita GNP, and yet the majority of the population would remain relatively poor if all that wealth were concentrated in the hands of a few. Still, as a rough way of measuring the comparative wealth of nations, it's a useful tool. For example, Canada's per capita gross national product for the year 2002 was calculated at around $29,500 US. In other words, in 2002, we generated $29,500 worth of wealth for every man, woman, and child in the country. That makes us one of the world's stronger economies. The per capita gross national product of the Dominican Republic in 2002 was significantly lower than Canada's, at $6,033. But the per capita gross national product of Haiti was only $1,467. And keep in mind, that doesn't mean that $1,467 is the average income in the country. There are people in Haiti who, by any standard you care to apply, are wealthy. In fact, it turns out that Haiti has a greater percentage of millionaires per population than any other country in the Caribbean or Latin America. There are more than 10,000 millionaires in this country of less than 8 million people. But the vast majority of Haitians live in absolute poverty, with an estimated income of only $250 a year. If you include my watch, my glasses, my shoes, what I'm wearing now costs more than $250. It's inevitable that the amount and distribution of wealth in a nation will affect the overall quality of life in that nation. It will affect things such as health care, education, life expectancy, and so on. Just consider life expectancy for a moment. The life expectancy of a Canadian at birth is almost 80 years. The life expectancy of a Dominican is 7 years less, 73. And it's less primarily because the country is poorer, because the Dominican diet isn't as good as the Canadian, because Dominicans don't have as much access to medical care as we do, and so on. But the life expectancy of a Haitian at birth is only 49 years. After poverty, probably the thing most North Americans and Europeans associate with developing countries is repressive and corrupt governments. Well, both the Dominican Republic and Haiti have had their share of those. Papa Doc Duvalier and his son Jean-Claude, known as Baby Doc, ruthlessly governed Haiti using a combination of the voodoo religion and simple terror from 1957 until 1986. Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic has the distinction of being considered by some historians as the last absolute dictator in history.
A rule which created fabulous wealth for a few and the grimmest of poverty for the majority. He ruled by the gun and died by the gun. And now
Trujillo reigned in the Dominican Republic from 1930 until his assassination in 1961. At the time of his death, he was one of the 10 richest men in the world. He was supported in his position by the Western industrialized powers, by the First World nations. One of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's cabinet members once memorably said of Trujillo, "He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." Trujillo maintained control of the country by an unscrupulous use of violence, intimidation, assassination, and torture.
a 31-year reign of terror and bloodshed comes to an end in the Dominican Republic as dictator Rafael Trujillo is shot down by 7 assassins. His victims were numbered in the tens of thousands during his iron-fisted rule of the island nation.
Finally, on the evening of May 30th, 1961, members of his own military waited in a car on this spot. They ambushed Trujillo as he was being driven to his home in San Cristobal. The assassination was supposed to set off a coup, but it failed. Instead, Trujillo's son Ramfis assumed control of the government. He tracked down most of the conspirators and arrested them. He imprisoned not only them, but their family members, tortured them all. When it became clear that the people of the Dominican Republic wouldn't support Ramfis's government, he took the 6 conspirators who were still living and had them tied to trees on his estate. Then, while they were still alive, cut their bodies into pieces and threw them to the sharks. The next day, the U.S. military gave Ramfis a military escort off the island, and he was given asylum in Europe.
A period of political instability followed, but By 1965, it appeared as if the popular Dominican Revolutionary Party, led by Juan Bosch, would be able to take control of the country. Bosch was a moderate socialist, an advocate for land reform and civil liberties. You might compare him with Canadian NDP leaders such as David Lewis or Ed Broadbent. But that still made him too radical for the taste of U.S. President Lyndon Johnson, who, declaring that he wouldn't tolerate a second Cuba in this hemisphere, sent U.S. Marines to Santo Domingo on April 28, 1965.
They were shooting all over the city, but the shooting was really concentrated in the city of Santo Domingo.
Andres Fortunato was 19 years old at the time.
Revolutionary anymore. So they got me while I was driving to see my family, and they put me in jail. And I was very close to lose my life. So I would identify myself as a part of the youth group of the Revolutionary Party, and they just grabbed me and took my gun off and put me in jail.
Popular opinion is right. Countries like the Dominican Republic and Haiti aren't like us. They're not like Canada or the United States. They have significantly more poverty than we have. They frequently, but not always, have had less democratic, more repressive governments than any we've had to deal with. But I think they're also different in that they generally have had less control over their own sovereignty, over their own destiny, than the more developed nations of the North have had. Some might argue that in this era of globalization and multinational corporations that no country has real sovereignty anymore, but clearly the situation is more pronounced for developing countries.
Other, stronger, richer countries still feel they have the right or authority to intervene in third world countries when they disapprove of the current leadership. And because of their economic vulnerability, countries like the Dominican Republic have to agree to what international creditors call structural adjustments, imposed upon them by external institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. Structural adjustments are internal changes that have to be brought about in a country before it's able to borrow the money it needs to continue operating. One of the structural adjustments imposed upon the Dominican Republic in 1997 was the privatization of power generation, of electricity. The immediate impact of this was a 51% increase in the cost of electricity. But there was no improvement in service. In fact, the country has been plagued by almost daily blackouts ever since.
And these countries differ in another way, in that we really do try to keep them out of sight, out of mind. You wouldn't guess, judging from the popular media, that these countries have 80% of the world's population, that they're the majority, that in effect the lifestyles of their citizens are the global norm. That's not something we want to think about too much because it can make us feel very uncomfortable. So we'd rather keep the blinders, keep the walls up. What we want to do in this series, however, is to peek behind the wall.
And if we do so honestly, we'll discover that to some extent the envious tourists we spoke of at the beginning of this program are right. There are many positive things about countries like the Dominican Republic: vibrant and attractive cultural institutions, creative individuals, successful entrepreneurial efforts. People in this country have just as much opportunity to live meaningful, constructive lives as people in Canada do. In fact, they often seem to have a lot more fun than Canadians do. There are a lot of things on the other side of this wall. There are people, very much like people in Canada, working to support their families, sending their children to school, arguing about politics, going to church. They have just as much national pride as Canadians do. They take as much pleasure and have as much anxiety in watching their children grow up. They find satisfaction in work, in sports, and personal relationships, just like Canadians do. But the majority of them are very conscious that they have no hope of ever attaining the same level of material comfort and wealth that the average Canadian takes for granted. That's simply something they cannot reasonably aspire to. Why that's the case is what we're going to examine in this series. Why is there this great discrepancy in opportunities between developed and developing countries? The material we'll be looking at won't always be easy to deal with. The issues are often complex and the effects we discuss are often pretty bleak.
And I think we need to admit from the beginning that any possible solution to the current global situation will necessarily be costly not only to the people of the developing world, but to us as well, to the 20% of us who live in more developed countries. So the next issue we need to look at is why we should care at all. What difference does it make to us, to the 20%, what conditions in the third world are like?